Hi, thanks very much for coming. I'm going to tell you a little bit about one thing that's next for science, and I'm going to use an example from my own research, but what I'm talking about is broadly applicable to science writ large. I'm going to talk to you about very big data that's been set free. Data for my whole career has been big. I've always had full diskettes. Now disks. Now RAIDs. When I started, they were 92 kilobytes. And I filled them. Then 100 megabytes. Then 10 gigabytes. And now huge amounts. So as physiologists, we looked at data in the kilobytes to maybe megabytes worth of data. Genomics, which has done a fabulous job both of being big and of sharing and being open, works in the megabytes to gigabytes range. I'm interested in shape. I'm interested in the shape of skeletons and the soft tissue that surrounds them. And those data are huge. So they run from the gigabytes to terabytes for single data sets. And data's always been big relative to our capabilities, but until very, very recently, data was not free. Data was locked into little silos in scientists' labs where you couldn't get at them, where I couldn't get at them, where their colleagues couldn't get at them, where their spouses and children couldn't get at them. Nobody could get at these data. Sometimes, 10 years later, they couldn't get at them. So I'm going to talk to you about big morphological data sets. The data set I'm going to talk about is computed tomography scans, CT scans. And first I'm going to tell you what a CT scan is, which requires some fabulous finger puppetry. Behold, a photorealistic bird. Look only at the screen. And you see the bird. And it is mysterious to you because you didn't see me come in with a bird. But now there's one. But if I freeze my hand in place, now look only at the screen, and rotate it through 180 degrees, watching just those shadows, in your brain, you can now not only see that that wasn't a bird, you can put your fingers in the same positions my fingers were in. You can deconvolve those shadows into the 3D shape of my hand. CT scanning is exactly that, except instead of light, it uses X-rays. So instead of a black and white shadow, there's a grayscale shadow, with the darkest bits being the most radio opaque, and the lightest bits being the least radio opaque. So the CT scan generates a 3D volume of density. The end result looks like that. That is a piranha, a beautiful fish that I scanned because I wanted to see its teeth, which are the business end of the thing, right? That's what everyone wants to see. But the moment I looked at that scan, I realized I knew something about how it lives. Way over on the side there, you can see two ribs that have been bisected, because this is a schooling fish that's really well armed. And when they have their little discussions amongst each other, they lead to serious wounds. So these models of skeletons can tell us how fish live. And I'm interested in CT scanning all of the fishes. Not every individual, but every species. It's 33,000 species of fish. And at conventional CT scanning rates, we're talking about a 45-year project. So just about when I hit middle age, I should be done. I plan to take up exercise between now and then. The killer is, this effort should cost between $300 and $300 million. And as much as I deeply love fish, and I really do, I mean, I'm deeply fascinated with them, I couldn't justify spending those kinds of funds on scanning fish skeletons. So we got a choice. We can either scan fewer species, or we can scan faster. And I am fundamentally not a fewer kind of person. So we raised some philanthropic funds, actually a very large set of donations, allowed us to buy a micro CT scanner that lives just down the hall in my office. And from this scanner, I discovered two truths, two what should have been obvious truths, but which to me at the time were not obvious at all. The first of these is that all CT scanning interrogates a cylindrical volume. How many people here have actually been in a CT scanner? Just give a raise of hand. Oh, wow, huge numbers. That's awesome. So you lay there in a bed, and either the bed goes into a donut, or in some models, the donut runs down the bed. That produces a beautiful three-dimensional image of the offending part of your body. What you may not know is that everything inside the donut, everything was scanned. You and your offending part. The bed, the air around, all of it was scanned. But we know what air looks like, and we know what beds look like, so this was terribly inefficient. We really should have piled at least half a dozen people on there with you, run them all through at once. Because everything was getting scanned. So that was the first realization. The second realization was more subtle. And it turns out to be true that you don't want all of the resolution. Anytime you take a picture, there's a certain size for those pixels. In CT, the analogy is voxels, that is volume elements. And all of you know, when you get a new camera, what do people ask you? Oh, how many megapixels is that? Right? That's what they ask. That's the first question. They don't ask, like, how much was it? Do you like it? Did you take a nice pic? No. How many megapixels? They want to know the resolution. If you own a CT scanner, that's the first thing they ask. Oh, what's the resolution? Second thing they ask is, how big a thing can I put in there? As though there were some universe where they would want to get 5,000 slices per millimeter of an entire dead hippopotamus, which would be more data than fit on all the hard disks in the United States right now. You don't want all the resolution. So how much do you want? I mean, that's a good question, and one that we've set about to answer. We looked at a lot of studies, and we found that it depends totally on what you're doing with it. And so what we had to do was figure out what the worst case was. What's the most resolution you could want? And it turns out that the most resolution you want, for practical purposes, is about 250 slices across the head. So give me a fish. I can measure the width of its head, and I can tell you what resolution you want to scan it at. That means that I can pre-print cylinders that I can pack with fish. The cylinder on your right is a 30-micron cylinder, 33 slices per millimeter. On your left, a cylinder that's larger. It's a 50-micron cylinder. It gives you 20 slices per millimeter. And I can just pack the fish in there. This doesn't work with humans in healthcare. It's an innovation I've proposed, but it turns out that people object. Dead fishes don't. It's one of the major reasons I work with them. The resolution you aim for depends on the fish size, which means when you bring hundreds of fish to my lab to scan them, the first thing I have you do is arrange them in size order. We then pick the specimens that are going to be scanned at a particular resolution, and we start loading up the cylinder. We can fit 10 to 20 specimens in that cylinder. And when we scan it, we get this. We have reimagined that staple of the midweek, the fish burrito. That is somewhere around 20 individual species in a group of sculpins, scanned by a graduate student named Thaddeus Busser. Thaddeus came to the lab and we developed this technique. This is the very first fish burrito that was ever scanned. I know this because it is missing a key innovation that came about with the second fish burrito that was ever scanned. Little radio opaque labels so that we could tell one fish from another. Because it turns out that only Thaddeus could do this next trick. Using free software, you can then dissect one fish out of the burrito, reposition it in some anatomically useful way, do this over and over again, and for one 2-hour CT scan, what was once an entire PhD dissertation is now the throat clearing for chapter 1. We can scan over 700 species per month with a single scanner. Not only that, the scanner's here. It's really heavy, and I'm not letting anybody take it anywhere. But the data can be processed off-site. Best of all, the data can be processed with free, open-source software that's available on every platform, Linux, Mac, PC, whatever you want. So we're talking about very, very big data. Over 2,000 species, over 4,000 specimens scanned in the last year. Because sometimes you want to know what happens to the skeleton as something grows. So you scan 20 of the same species. We've scanned over 300 families of fishes, and as of yesterday, we're sitting on 56 terabytes of information. I can't tell you how unhappy I would be if those data were something I had to encompass, that I had to surround and defend from prying eyes. The best thing about these data is they are completely open access. Anyone can get access to all of these data and analyze it with free software. Anyone in the world, anywhere in the world. This completely democratizes the process of dealing with these really critical morphological data points. So we've leveraged accessibility to get lots of people access and learn a lot more than we ever could. We put these things up on a really neat website called MorphoSource. So you can go here and download any of the data sets, and we're already seeing the benefits. I got a very apologetic email from a wonderful German neurobiologist, Michael Hoffman, who was terribly embarrassed to tell me that he had downloaded all of my data. And because he's a web wizard and great at making surfaces, he had taken all of my data and taken these slices and turned them into 3D printable, rotatable models. And he'd put them up on a website for anybody to download for any purpose. And he was very sorry because he wasn't sure I was getting enough credit for it. Please, do more terrible things like this to me. This is awesome. So now you can go to this virtual museum of natural history, and Michael's put my name embarrassingly on the front page saying, here's a bunch of Adam's fish. They're not my fish. They're everybody's fish. The availability of these data allowed a computer sciences team interested in the concept of extracting an object from a field of data that was completely unknown. It inspired them to try their tools on my fish burritos. And so they produced this thing called Topo Angler. And they took a job that we were doing manually over the course of 6 or 7 hours and dropped it down to a 15-minute task. Because the data were there. They could have it for any purpose they wanted. So, what's next for science? What's next is a lot more collaboration, a lot more sharing of data. More open access data, more open access publication of scientific results, so that you're not sitting there reading some terrible excuse for science news. You can follow a link and get to the scientific paper. And most excitingly, the availability of these huge data sets to everybody invite synergies across fields. Physicists, chemists, computer scientists, and biologists all realizing that we work on very similar problems and often need very similar tools. So these 3D data, which, for me are useful as inspiration for new engineering and new technologies and biomaterials, for other people might be useful for something completely different. In fact, their highest purpose is certainly not the ideas that I have as I'm gathering these data. The highest purposes are out there. And by giving people access, we ensure that the possibility that they fulfill these is there. So what's next is more access, more collaboration. Thank you.